So, folks, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to move us through kind of my take on where the economy is going. I'm going to talk about the election results and kind of where economists have focused their efforts over the last couple of weeks. Now that we have the results with respect to what the platform was of the Trump campaign and what might be the ultimate outcomes, at least in the short to medium term of the Trump administration. I will then talk about the regional situation and then think forward in terms of small business and things that I see out there that you may want to think about in terms of the next year or so with respect to the North Coast and some of the things that might be changing, kind of what you think of as sort of the tailwinds and headwinds for business in that region, in your region. So whenever I talk to small businesses, I've talked to plenty of chamber groups. I've talked to plenty of small business advocate groups. I always think about four major items. Is one, where are you going to get your customers? What's going on with cost? What's going on with the tax environment in terms of not only sort of the federal and state level taxes, but also what it takes to get things done locally, and how big of a partner are the local municipalities in terms of small business. And then finally, your employees. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today are going to be sort of directly or indirectly affecting these four big buckets that I think if you can't solve these four problems, it's very tough to stay in business anywhere, much less as a small business that's struggling to survive, especially in sort of shifting environments, if you will. So at the national level, we're going to go from sort of the labor market on through to the latest forecasts. And what I usually start groups with is I start with a look at the last two sort of recessions, recovery periods, and then ultimately the expansion periods that got us to where we are today. This first graph is or shows the total number of people working in the United States, where I set November 2007 equal to 100. It took us 78 months to get back to that same number. So we call the Great Recession because it took so long to get the same number of people working in the United States as we saw before the downturn. And you can see that long stretch of time where it really was the recovery period after the Great Recession and the global financial crisis. This is what it looks like since January 2020 in terms of the total number of people working in the United States. So if I take January 2020's total number of people working in the United States after seasonal adjustments and set that equal to 100, that's what's happened since. So that black line is, or was at least originally, a big focus of the Federal Reserve and policymakers and politicians in terms of, can we keep people working and we can continue jobs growth, recovering, going from the bottom of the black line through the red dotted line, which means we got back what we lost, at least in the aggregate, not necessarily in the mix, but in the aggregate, and then growth from there. So that 104.7 number at the far side says that in October 2024, we're 4.7% more people working in the United States than we were in January 2020. And as long as that black line continues to rise or does not turn back toward the red dotted line, we're not going to have a second declared recession anytime soon in the United States. The Trump administration is going to be very focused on continuing that jobs growth, because the last thing they want to do is come in and start to see people lose their jobs or to see a contraction of the number of businesses that are looking for workers. We will see how that plays, and I'll give some comments on this in just a bit. In terms of what the Federal Reserve may be doing, the next big thing is going to happen in early December. So the focus of the Federal Reserve, at least since mid-2023, has been on trying to get prices down. So a lot of interest rate movement happened in 2022 and 2023 with the idea that we wanted to cap inflation. I'm going to walk us through with this graph, what it tells us in just a second along those lines with respect to inflation. But the bottom line is that the Federal Reserve has cut 2 times already this year and just in the last few months. And a big question is whether or not they will cut rates again and sort of ease credit conditions, which helps small business, helps customers, and in essence declares somewhat victory over the curbing of the inflation pressure that took place after 2021. But let's look at this graph and recognize what's going on here. So the blue solid line in this graph is the percentage change in the price of goods and services we buy at home, what we can think of as personal consumption expenditures, and what that percentage change is looking back 12 months. So for most of this period from January 2007 forward, it's been very slow, steady, predictable inflation. And then after we got through the pandemic recession, which is that second shaded skinny area on the right-hand side, the larger shaded area on the left-hand side is the period of the Great Recession. We saw inflation really take off. So part of that was because we had low interest rates. The other part is we did a lot of fiscal stimulus, and the combination of the two created a lot of demand as we came out of the pandemic's sort of shutdown, and then up the ladder we went. And we stayed up there for a while. But when interest rates began to rise in 2022 and 2023, inflation subsided, and we've seen that slide down to where we are, at least in the latest data, September 2024, at 2.7% inflation. Now, this is called core because economists tend to not look at food and energy products and services and the price changing of those items as much as we look at everything else, because the supposition is that food and energy prices can change episodically, either due to bad harvests, conflict, a refinery explosion, some weird thing happening in the Suez Canal. And policymakers don't want to make decisions based on, let's say, episodic changes in prices. They want to think what's happening with trends. So core is meant to sort of grab the trend in prices. That trend has been declining. But the key is that it's still above that blue dotted line. The Federal Reserve wants prices to kind of weave around that blue dotted line on average over time. And you can see what happened in the 2010s below that line. For the 2020s, we've basically been above that line. So the Federal Reserve is trying to reestablish that rhythm around that blue dotted line. And what's important about that makes interest rates predictable. It should, in theory, make consumer costs and business costs more predictable. And we just shape those outcomes. The current forecast of where we're going over the next few years, those red dots in that shaded area. So if the Federal Reserve is able to do its job right, it should, in essence, weave that blue solid line through those red dots toward the blue dotted line. But some of the big questions that now exist are we going to see another rate cut in December? Has the election and what the Trump administration is talking about doing changed the outlook, those red dots being the forecast through 2027 for inflation in such a way that by continuing to lower rates, it will exacerbate inflation pressure once the other policies are engaged? And that's a really tricky game to play. And we'll see what the Federal Reserve does. Right now, Wall Street is betting that we'll see one quarter of 1 point cut in December. And then the Federal Reserve might hold for at least 1 quarter, with the idea they want to see what policies play out and then make sure that they're reacting correctly in terms of not exacerbating inflation again. Because the other thing to think about real quick is that 2.7% number looks good on the surface. But in that period of time where inflation was relatively high, we have compounding inflation that is a regressive tax. So our small businesses and our lower to middle income homes are most affected by that increase in prices. The next stop is to think about whether or not there's going to be much of a change. The answer is no. Interest rates are going to pretty much move based on these data. So this graph is pulled right out of the Federal Reserve's deck when they make a policy decision. If we look forward at the forecast for the next few years more generally, these data just came out last week. So the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Branch interviews 40 people who are forecasters for the U.S. economy every quarter and says, well, what do you think is going to happen over the next few years to specific economic variables? And I pull 3 variables out from that discussion. The first one is real GDP growth or income after inflation. So those numbers, starting with that shaded area and 2.7, is the percentage change in income after we take inflation into account. And 2.7% growth for this year is actually good. And the column next to it, which is called previous, is what last quarter's forecast was. So these forecasters have got a little bit more optimistic about this year, and you can see to 2025, they got a little bit more optimistic about 2025. They did not know the election results yet when this forecast was put together. So just keep that in mind, and I'll come back and talk about that in just a second. 2026 is a little worse, but not that much. In 2027, the fog really creeps into where you have no idea what's happening. And economists generally are not very good after about 2.5 years of forward looking. So generally speaking, this means there's really no recession on the horizon based on these forecasts. And we're having very slow and steady growth, very similar, maybe ironically, to where we were basically 2015 to 2019. One of the reasons why there's a lot of optimism about the next few years is because our labor markets have not really shown much contraction. So I showed you right off the top this sort of continued growth of jobs. The unemployment rate is kind of the inverse of that, has been slow, steady, and relatively low in terms of movements over the last few years, especially when we came out of the pandemic and kind of reacquired a pre-pandemic, if you want to say it this way, kind of a new space. The unemployment rate really is not changing much over the next few years. Now, why is that true? It's kind of 2 reasons why we should think that we might not see a whole lot of movement in labor markets. One is that we're likely to see a relatively business-friendly administration, and we kind of knew that was going to happen regardless of what administration was voted in. But the other thing is we're not seeing a lot of people continue to come back into the labor force. We feel like that we've kind of peaked out in the current cycle in terms of people who weren't working and kind of sitting around waiting to see how wages were going to go and what job opportunities were there, and now are suddenly reemerging on the labor market. That's going to be slow enough to where demand will probably absorb those new workers. And as long as demand and supply find each other, unemployment's not going to change that much. So that's good for growth because people keep on getting paid. There's not a lot of people unemployed for now. We will see. But that's the current forecast. And those core PCE inflation percentages are the same thing we just saw in the last graph when we talked about prices. So in general, There's no recession in the forecast in terms of the national level. I'll talk a little bit about California and talk about the North Coast and the North State and kind of thinking the more rural spaces in California and what's happening there in a minute. But we're in what's kind of thought of as a late cycle economy. We have really strong labor markets. We have inflation that's kind of found a new medium. And generally speaking, short of any weird policies happening, we should have pretty good growth going forward. Now, with that said, let's talk about what economists think is going to happen over the next at least couple of years until the midterm elections, with the idea of how would the Trump campaign platform start to translate itself into Trump administration policy. These big six are at the top, are kind of the big six ideas with respect to how economists are watching what's going to happen. One, we should expect aggressive tariff changes, but maybe not to the percent levels we've heard in the campaign, which sounded at times historically relatively high to just completely ludicrous in terms of recent economic history globally in terms of how tariffs are used. But we should expect that used at least as a threat to try to move into new trade agreements or trying to at least recapture what the Trump administration sees as lost manufacturing, lost jobs, lost opportunities for American businesses. And immigration is kind of a weird sidebar on that, because while we are going to try to restrict trade or imports from other places by increasing prices of those imports, we're at the same time looking to reduce the number of workers available to take advantage of that change in market share, theoretically, if everything were to work out correctly, by potentially having some kind of deportation scheme that will increase the number of workers or number of undocumented residents in the United States being forced to leave, which is going to affect the number of workers available out there. So watch for those two against each other. We should not expect much change in the current tax structure. We should expect some change in the size of government, which has also some irony to it in terms of how much that will change and how much these other things like tariff compliance and actually carrying out immigration in a new level will kind of juxtapose against trying to shrink the government. So there's a lot of conflicting issues in terms of how you actually make the rubber meet the road out there with respect to running federal government. The next is whether or not we're going to see defense pick up, and that'll be more of a global thing. If the Trump administration puts more pressure on our treaty partners to increase their spending, that could help American firms. And we'll see that childcare incentives in terms of having the childcare tax credit is likely to stick around, if not be augmented. The Trump campaign had that as a pretty big deal. We'll see if it holds. But for Humboldt County, and think about how that translates, we should expect higher costs of doing business, at least initially. And whether that is directly related to policy or indirectly related to the idea that policy change is coming, we got to see that happening. We might have some local opportunities for entrepreneurship in the sense that if the tariffs open up market share, in the short term, that might help. But how much that is going to be helpful versus the cost change is still a very open question. And most economists believe it will be more costly than beneficial based on what the current promises are for tariffs from the Trump administration. We should expect wages to rise, and that inflation pressure I talked about before, while inflation has come down, it has compounded and it's still positive. So workers are still trying to keep up with whatever price changes are. So wage pressure is going to be there. And we have to expect also, with that sort of small amount of labor force available, that worker search and the time it takes to find somebody is going to rise. Now, whether or not that translates into technological adaptation or not is a whole other ballgame. We could have done the whole day today on AI and its potential future, especially in rural parts of California. We don't know what political environment we're going to see. So we're already seeing the beginnings of California being somewhat hostile against the federal government and vice versa. We will see how much that changes the cost of doing business in California, and whether or not we're going to see a shift in infrastructure projects that might change funding that we thought was moving toward places like Humboldt County and actually see it regress and move other places because the Trump administration sees itself as having different priorities, let's say, than the Biden White House had. So watch for those things. But news-wise, we're going to be talking about what the tariff situation and kind of international trade and sort of geopolitics around trade, as well as the movement of people, meaning migration, immigration, and deportation, at least for the first 12 months of the administration, because either those policies are going to be engaged or there's going to be a lot of talk about why they were not engaged. Thus, those will be the dominant news topics and kind of what's going to be front of people's minds until the actual effects show their face. Okay, so that's kind of the national picture, and boy, is there a lot of uncertainty. In California, what's been happening, and let's just start with workers. So when we look at California, a couple things have happened since the pandemic that have not completely recovered yet. One is the number of people who live in California who are either looking for work or working, and this includes self-employed people. So if you look from January 2010 on a seasonally adjusted basis, we saw a slow, steady movement from the Great Recession up to a peak, the shock of the pandemic, the sort of sorting out period, and then we saw recovery engage, but we have not recovered completely. So the number of people who live in California that are either looking for work or working is still below where we were in at the end of 2019. And if we look at that chunk that is actually working, that has had exactly the same situation with one little weird twist on it. And if you look at the far right-hand side, the number of people who live in California who have a job has basically been flat for the last 25 or 6 months. So you can see that orange line has kind of wobbled around. But really, if you go back to sort of mid-2022 and look where we are in fall 2024, no real change. That's a long period of time outside of a recession for there to be basically flat growth of working residents of California. And the real twist is that the number of people who work for a California-based employer, which is the black line, now has a larger quantity than the number of Californians that have a job. And that's because Californians have left California but kept their California-based job. And we've also, as employers, we've looked outside California to hire new people. And you can see that black line has basically trended up for most of the recovery period, a couple little hiccups here and there, but it's kind of driven a lot of what's happened nationally as well. But California's employers continue to hire. So when you look at that picture, you have to say to yourself, well, what's going on here? And what's going on is that California is going through kind of a slow and steady demographic change. And how much of that is reflective on rural places like the North Coast is something we're going to get into here in a minute, thinking forward about what are some of the challenges and potential opportunities for small businesses along the North Coast. So to start with, let's look at what's happened in Humboldt. So these, believe it or not, these are actually seasonally adjusted numbers into the same rhythm we just saw with the state. So here's the labor force evolution since 2010. The difference, instead of sort of steadily inclining, is that in Humboldt County, the number of people that are available for work or working has been steadily declining, then stopped, fell, started to recover a little bit, and has actually just seen a little bit of a pickup over the last, let's say, 12 months. But generally speaking, is still kind of trending down. A lot of this sort of wrapped around population change as well. But this tells a story about a reduced number of workers along the North Coast, where Humboldt is seen as kind of a hub of that area between Del Norte and sort of northern Mendocino County moving over toward Trinity. So that, if you see that the idea there is there's fewer workers available. You're probably feeling that on the street. This is the chunk of those folks that are in fact employed. So the difference between those two is the unemployed. And you can see, though, they both have curled up a little bit, and we'll see if those trends continue. But the number of people employed who live in Humboldt County has also not quite recovered. And again, this includes self-employed people. So there's been a lot of talk about new businesses that have started and this sort of explosion of entrepreneurship that came out of the pandemic. A lot of that were sort of second and third gigs, rather than, let's say, this rush of people that suddenly saw themselves as entrepreneurs. And we're really seeing that sort of slowly play out in California's labor data, much less in more rural parts of California. This is hiring in Humboldt. So just like California, the good thing about this is that Humboldt's employers have kind of steadily continued to hire back, but also are really just now recovering from where we were right before the pandemic. So same deal. The good thing about this is we saw a slight increase after about 2013. We peaked, sharp cut, then recovery, and are just now starting to slowly expand. So the good thing is that has not flattened out. If you look at counties like Butte, Shasta, to a certain extent, places like Siskiyou, not so much Trinity. Trinity's kind of going through some weirdness, and I'll talk about that later in terms of it's so small that the labor data are kind of weird, and also the forecasting is very optimistic about what might happen in Trinity County, which I'll get back to at the end, just to give you kind of maybe a smile about what happens in Sacramento with respect to forecasts about rural California and whether or not that's really on the street, what you'd expect in Trinity County. But this is good in the sense it shows that local employers see demand there. We want that black line to continue to rise. And you can see those gaps there in the box. So somewhat of a mixed bag in terms of employment in the aggregate for Humboldt County, but doing slightly better than the state on average in terms of hiring back in local residents, about the same in terms of hiring overall. Okay, this is the forecast through 2030. So if we start at the end of 2023, so I don't want to go too fast, that 100 line is at 2019. So if you take 2019's year end as a pre-pandemic benchmark, you can see you're going to see a pattern evolve. Sharp cut, coming back, hopefully expansion, meaning that we see the line associated with the county in question go above the red dotted line and continue to rise toward 2030. So there's Del Norte County. This is Humboldt County. So this is the idea here is the total number of people working for a locally based employer in each one of these counties. So this follows exactly what we just said. By the end of 2024, we should basically be recovered. You can see that here for Humboldt County. We just saw that in the graph. Here's Mendocino County. Mendocino County looks a lot more like Butte County in terms of its recovery, where it's sort of been very flat in coming out with respect to a rural northern county. And Mendocino County has a little bit more trouble in terms of how cannabis has affected Mendocino County and really kind of being a tweener between the recent impulses in Humboldt County and Sonoma, Napa counties in terms of what's happened there as reflected of what the Bay Area has provided in terms of, let's say, movement of people toward those counties. We'll see where Mendocino County goes. This is Trinity. The supposition is Trinity is actually going to have kind of a breakout time over the next few years. If you look at the data for Trinity, it hasn't quite happened yet in this sort of trajectory, but that's what the forecasters are out there saying. And this is California. So the two ideas here is that California should continue to see hiring, which we saw before in that first graph about California. It's going to start to peak out toward the end of the decade. But notice the gap that exists between the state on average and these rural counties, especially in the North Coast counties. So we're not really seeing what you could think of as a change in the forecast and thus a change in the mentality about what happens on the North Coast and how those counties can actually break out and find more niche opportunities for small businesses or just businesses in general to take them on through the end of the decade. So one of the things we're concerned about is whether or not a major employer is going to leave. And this happened in Mendocino County a long time ago. It's happened in other rural counties. I mean, just even a governmental employer leaving is a big deal. In Plumas County, we had a correctional facility shut down and removed about 10% of the workforce within 2 or 3 months. So that's something you don't want to see happen, is sort of have a larger employer say, well, I can't do this anymore. I have to leave, or have a governmental shift. And this is what's also so concerning about the federal government and how they're going to look for cost savings. Will that mean that that's going to expose risk in rural California? Whether cannabis will continue to be a drag or a boost is also a big question. We don't know how cannabis will evolve over the next few years, short of the idea that it doesn't look like there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure in the government to sort of continue to migrate toward nationalization. We will see, the Trump White House might see that as an opportunity, especially if Elon Musk, and this isn't meant to be pejorative, but if Elon Musk remains as kind of an advisor to President Trump, whether or not he sees opportunities in that space and kind of it stays in his ear that why don't we just nationalize it and get it over with? This is a brand new business opportunity. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's not what at least where I read, that's not necessarily a drumbeat that's happening big time yet, but it's something we have to think about is whether or not for the North Coast, specifically Humboldt and Mendocino, whether cannabis helps or hurts. We should expect growth in healthcare, tourism, and construction as sort of the drivers of these forecasts. If there's 3 industries that are going to sort of lead these counties by the nose out and beyond the pandemic shadow, it should be those industries. And we have to assume that there's no natural disaster. So these forecasts do not assume a major natural disaster that changes the nature of how we do business in these local areas. Again, I do a lot of work in Butte County, so I tend to use it as kind of a poster child for good, bad, and indifferent changes over the last few years. The campfire shadow still very much exists in Butte County 6 years on. And it happened in 2 major ways. One is we saw a shift in the population, and we also saw a shift in the way that demand was there for local merchants and local employers in such a way that it shifted the way that employers hired people. So they're still trying to work that out there and how many housing units to generate, how many people are really going to show up in Butte County over the next few years. All that is still a major question. And once workers come, will they stay? So one of the things about workforce development and economic development, when they work hand in hand, especially to help small business, is that when workers show up, you want them to be there and you want them to be a part of the community. Well, we had this wild movement of population right out of the gate in the pandemic, and now we're starting to see a call back to the office. Will that mean that there's going to be a shift in population again? So watch housing units and how many housing units are starting to go up, especially for people move from other places who now feel like they've run the profits through. And do not look at the local labor market as a place that they really has tied them to a job or a career. These are issues to watch over time, because that's the nexus of economic and workforce development, especially for small businesses, are there training opportunities locally that then become career opportunities, especially if you're trying to hire? Will you find those workers here, or will you have to think about how much you can really grow because of a lack of workers? So housing is another piece of that. This is the current housing forecast from Zillow. Most housing forecasts for California are very similar in the sense there's not a whole lot of action happening over the next year in most forecasters' minds. The idea is twofold. One, we don't expect a lot of units to go up in either existing or new, which means the supply side of the market really isn't going to change that much. And with lower interest rates and perhaps a little bit more optimism about where the economy is going, especially if you don't have a labor market shock, demand should continue to kind of bump along at the current pace. So if supply and demand equal each other, there's not going to be a whole lot of change in price. And you can see that here. However, if you look at the far right-hand side, there are some names that we've talked about off and on throughout this time together so far. Butte County, Lake County, Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity have the lowest right now forecast, but these aren't terrible numbers. It's just a reminder that there is pressure on how people are thinking about staying in these rural counties and whether or not the economic opportunities give them an incentive to stay. Now, the funny thing is there's a lot of people who have housing in these areas who are now at like a 3.5 or 3.75% mortgage that without a labor market shock, them leaving means they're basically moving into a much higher housing cost environment. So we will see how much these forecasts actually play out, but there has been downward price pressure in these rural areas, especially along the North Coast over the last 18 months or so. And some of that is tied to cannabis and its slow evolution or devolution, depending on your perspective. It's also that the original rush coming out of the pandemic has somewhat plateaued. So this gives you a little bit more data in terms of thinking about Humboldt County. The median home price in October 2024 was about 432,000. That's down about 3% from October 2023. It's up about 11%, however, over that long stretch of time. So Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity, San Francisco counties are 4 of the sort of bottom 10 in terms of housing growth since the pandemic, where California average is about 44%. So if you think about, if you had bought a home in California in 2019, it's 44 or almost 45% higher in price at the median of the distribution over that 5-year stretch. So there are places in California, Santa Barbara, San Diego, Riverside County, believe it or not, San Bernardino, that have seen 50 plus growth in terms of percentage change in housing prices at the middle of the distribution. So we got to think about what that means in terms of, it's certainly a good thing if you're trying to buy in the North Coast. It's tricky if you think that you bought a home and you wanted to see that wealth ascension that hasn't quite come at the same speed. So real quick on cannabis, if you look at licenses and really what the core delivery of in Mendocino and Humboldt County specifically is, it's really in cultivation and a little sprinkle of manufacturing. I just finished a study for DCC or the Department of Cannabis Control earlier this year, looking at Lake, Sonoma, Mendocino, Humboldt, Del Norte, and Trinity counties and the cannabis industry in those 6 counties. And it's so promising in terms of the cultivation piece. It's tricky in terms of the other parts of the supply chain. But as I'll talk about in a minute, so much of it is how to really think about preserving those entrepreneurs and seeing cannabis outside the cultural aspects and really as a business, and that we really have a split. We have to remember that there are a lot of entrepreneurs in that space that need to be supported, that were either told a story that the regulators did not deliver or had no real support in terms of making the transition as a business in such a way that when the larger players came, it really deflated the market to their detriment. One thing is that some people are hanging on is whether or not the cannabis cafe will be a game changer. My take is it will not be that huge of a change, but that's my opinion. But it is a way of thinking about linking and making some collaboration between tourism, restaurants, bars, the cannabis industry, and how to kind of give people a complete experience if they want it, telling the story. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So when you think about the small business perspective, what can cannabis businesses do in my mind? They can think about partnerships and starting to collect more businesses within the supply chain and becoming a hub from everything from cultivation to product. Now, retail is tough because the base of people to sell cannabis products to is not as large here. So you want to distribute those products to larger places, but then it's really about getting the niche nailed. Can the Emerald Triangle angle be something that becomes like Napa and Sonoma in wine? Can it have the history, the entrepreneurship, the lifestyle, everything that people are looking for within cannabis that is a different story that's really about the long history of it in these areas and what that means? And thus you got to tell those stories. But we know we need regulatory flex, and at the same time, the industry needs to flex. The industry itself has got to get out of its way to a certain extent. But we got to have that partnership all the way from government on down to small business. When we think about late workforce at another level, I kind of think about both population and what's happening in schools. So in September 2024, Department of Financing sort of queuing up what's going to be part of the governor's budget in January, started to release population projections. And then the next panel we're going to show just was released about 10 days ago. This is a way of looking at least the current forecast through 2035, thinking 2023, we kind of know, and what's going to happen to 2035. If you take 2023 and make it equal to 100, Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity, and Sonoma counties all basically either flat or losing population over that 12-year stretch. So that's going to happen for two reasons. One, there's going to be a little bit more outbound migration, but we're also going to age. So one of the biggest sort of lurking problems of the North Coast, which stretches all the way down to the Golden Gate Bridge and kind of all the way around the top of California, back down to the northern Sacramento Valley, is an aging population. People have moved to Northern California and its rural spaces looking for lower cost housing and potentially a place to retire. And this has happened for decades, but it has sped up. The pandemic gave people more impetus to do that, especially if they were in the sort of waning years of their career. So watch for that demographic trend to continue. And what that then means is through 2060, we might even see it worsen. So this is the current forecast circulating around Sacramento for these counties through 2060. So this is more the longer view. And demographers are much better at the longer view than economists, but keep watching for that and kind of thinking about what your locally elected officials are seeing in terms of the longer term fate of the population in these counties, specifically Humboldt County. If we look at what's happening with K through 12 attendance. So the sort of the next phase of thinking about population change is say, okay, and how does that affect our schools and how does it affect labor force? Not so much people who would come to work locally, but who in fact would indigenously show up because they were kids that grew up here that might be retained as workers. This is California. So believe it or not, the state on average is seeing a fade over the next 10 years to about 10% less kids in school. And a lot of that's because California is also aging and we're also having fewer kids. This is Del Norte County, a much speedier decline, but really kind of starting to decline later in this decade. This is Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity, which again, I told you we'd see some funny things about Trinity. Here we go. Demographers believe that Trinity County has brought this new families that have moved to Trinity County, which I don't think if you're in Trinity County, you'd actually see so much on the street, but they think this is happening from the data they're gathering. And then there is Sonoma County. And the reason I included Sonoma County here is because Sonoma County, when you start thinking about an aging population and a macrocosm of the North Coast, can we look at Sonoma and Napa counties as sort of precursors of what's going to continue to happen to the north part or the northern parts of those counties? Or north of those counties. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. A big split here where it just takes Trinity County away. California generally is going down in terms of the number of kids in school. It is something we need to watch for, the slow devolution of labor force and what that means for small business and finding workers. So you can see that there. In terms of a forecast looking forward to 2020 or 2030, we saw that before, but if we want to look and see what's happening in terms of the growth with respect to what's happened since the pandemic, these are the centers of where we've seen growth in terms of jobs. So if you look on the far left-hand side, we've seen a real comeback in terms of healthcare, a little bit on the ag side, a little bit in terms of tech and construction through California, and even in Humboldt County, some of it wrapped around Cal Poly. But the bottom line is in a lot of these cases that it's really been driven by services, construction, and transportation and warehousing. So we've seen a real surge in those that are coming to sort of distribute goods around our counties. This is something to watch and see if that continues. On the far right-hand side, you can see manufacturing, retail, and finance have basically faded. So we're watching to see whether or not this continues moving forward or not. But if we think about where the strengths of Humboldt County are, it really is in those classic sort of healthcare, construction, and ag, if you want to see it that way. The trick is that ag here, I actually counted cannabis jobs as I estimated them. We don't have cannabis jobs yet in the official data. So think about that too when you see the labor data for Humboldt County. They're really not counting anybody associated with the cannabis industry directly. Okay, so now let's wrap up a little bit. It's my take that the more collaboration we have, the better. And unfortunately, I didn't show this in the right order. You're going to see in the background a jellyfish, and I should have flipped them. But one thing is to think about, again, how cannabis can become a bigger partner in terms of tourism and really kind of thinking about expanding the supply chain, analogous to what the wine industry has done in Sonoma and Napa counties, but sort of really thinking about tell the stories, get people to come here and really recognize that it's more than just cannabis. It is really stories about people, stories about trying to help people, especially on the medical side, and how that can sell itself. The jellyfish you see behind her is supposed to be in front of this picture, but the point is that we also think about how the ocean is a place of entrepreneurship, science, and very unique opportunities that Humboldt County, with the partnership with Cal Poly over time, has in drawing a global audience to that area to do work, to do science, and really to generate more merchants. So some of the things I think about are, can we get our tribal communities more involved in terms of thinking about a broader community? We have to recognize that competition is rising. So having those kind of partnerships are very positive for the community, because without it, these other areas, especially coming from the population centers of California north, there's going to be a lot of businesses trying to pick those people off as they're driving north, and recognizing the need that you want to really think about putting eyeballs on the North Coast and where the niche is. So how much more entrepreneurship can come out of Cal Poly is that what you call in the business tech transfer out of universities, and landing in Humboldt County as a jobs generator just helps in concentric circles small business to thrive. So those are the kind of things that when you think about policy, what needs to happen is start building up those relationships in such a way that when business is formed, it wants to stay there. One of the biggest challenges of rural California, and this again stretches basically from northern Sonoma County all the way around the northern part of California to the northern Sacramento Valley, thinking north of I-80, is why am I going to come there and start a business or expand one? And where am I going to find workers, and who am I going to sell things to? If we're aging faster in those areas, does that change the type of business that shows up and the other merchants that are there and their longevity in terms of being able to serve that marketplace? So if we start thinking again toward 2030, and that's kind of where I look in terms of my forecast window, we're already in the late 2020s. I told you earlier, we're in kind of a late cycle economy. Can we continue to sort of truck along through the next few years? We don't know what's going to happen in terms of the next administration. We have some clues based on the platform, but the supposition is that the mix of things that happen will probably be somewhat business friendly in some ways, somewhat not business friendly in others. And the mix, as the data emerge, will probably be adjusted over time, because the supposition is the Trump administration does not want to kill small business, nor does it want to really detriment the economy. It wants to make some pretty broad changes sociopolitically. Those usually do not necessarily walk hand in hand, which means you need to watch for simple things. So if migration slows down as we're being promised, and we actually see mass deportations in some volume, you shouldn't expect 1 million people a year to be moved forcibly out of the United States. But let's say it's 100,000 every 6 months, or even 100,000 every quarter. That's going to start to affect labor markets, but will also affect things like taxable sales and rents. So if you're looking for places to see, once you start to see the movement of people in the data that starts to suggest that change is taking place, lower taxable sales and rent stagnation, if not reduction of rent, will be the first two places to watch that are a little bit more real-time gauges of how those changes in the labor market and ultimately in the consumer market are starting to affect the economy. So whenever I think about the North Coast, and I do about 2 or 3 of these a year, and like I said, I just got done with a relatively major grant-driven study about the North Coast. How will Cal Poly continue to be an engine, especially if it continues to grow in terms of students for Humboldt County? So one of the biggest things about a rural university is to have students who come there stay there. And that brain flight happens not only from K through 12, but also you educate people that came there because you have this asset there, and then they leave. Is there a way of creating opportunities for students to come and stay, which then makes your labor force and your population younger over time, but also having business opportunities come out of the university? So does the ocean provide those? Do greater links to visitors and kind of thinking about, like I said earlier, the cannabis supply chain getting a little bit more integrated in Humboldt County as much as possible? These are things to watch. The trick is being both optimistic and realistic. So rural California, especially coastal California, where logistics are a problem, and as Nancy alluded to earlier, I had a logistics issue about a month ago trying to get there through a transportation mode that was not me in control. We have to be thinking that is not going to get solved overnight. So what is special and what are the things you can do given the resources, the infrastructure, and sort of the nature of the communities that you're engaged in there in the North Coast? This is where it gets a little bit trickier than a place that's got a little bit more connectivity to a larger population area in terms of infrastructure and just being a place where you can grab more market share relatively quickly. So watch for that and whether or not the ocean-based businesses or what's happening in the so-called blue economy start to stretch into forestry. There are things that Cal Poly will try to look at as niche in terms of driving students there and driving potential business opportunities and partnerships. And this should be true for the entirety of the North Coast. But how far it can stretch its wings is also something to be realistic about, especially over the next 5 or 10 years. So folks, with that, I'll take your questions. I did see a couple pop up in the chat. Let me try to answer this one real quick. And please, folks, once I get done with this, just keep those things pumping into the chat. Or if you have put your hand up, Ken, I see your hands up. Just one moment, please. Karen asks, I'm wondering how the aging population fits in the lack of children and the forecast looks like for ag and construction. Are those jobs looking for younger people? And the answer is yes, they are looking for younger people. One of the biggest problems with both farming and construction is that we have another round of sort of generational aging out of those, and then family farms that are going to have to think about succession planning and whether or not a younger group is going to come in, whether it's a younger generation of the same family or young entrepreneurs that see themselves as wanting to be outside. You got to start thinking about marketing those opportunities early and trying to draw that workforce in. But again, remember, as long as students continue to come to Cal Poly, you will have folks there who might see themselves as wanting to be outside, wanting to be a part of farming that is maybe unique, globally unique in that sense. Continue to think about that too. The construction piece is tricky because you really do need a younger workforce to get a lot of that work done. But in sort of a nasty twist, construction is one of those places, especially for things like framing, roofing, maybe plumbing. If it's relatively standardized, you're going to see more robotics and AI pop up in those markets for construction. The less and less construction firms can find workers. Those are being developed as we speak. And if we lack a labor force that wants to work in that area, especially if we see migration changes, we might see some real twists there too. So Karen, I hope that that's helpful. Yeah, there may very well be AI in permitting for sure. So watch for that in terms of how government might become a little bit more, you want to say it this way, efficient along those lines. But government also has to think about becoming a bigger partner for all this to work in terms of really sustaining what's there and growing what goes on in the North Coast. Ken.
Thanks, Dr. Eyler. I'm probably the most ironic person in the room today. I have a lot of respect for you in doing these forecasts, but I'm a futurist in studying change for the past 40 years, and I usually blow up forecasts for a living. But I appreciate all of the ranges that you provided, especially the time frame. I just mentioned a couple of things, and I want to get your reaction. It's more of a global to local question. On the housing front, I'll just say real quick, we're working with tribes up here in Humboldt on a new style of housing that you're going to be very surprised in your future forecasts. We're going to bring a whole level of new construction and workforce development to our area we've not seen ever. We're building our own housing here. It's carbon negative. It's fire retardant. You can't burn this stuff. It's called hempcrete. We just presented to executives from the affordable housing industry in California and San Diego last week, very successfully. So that's kind of, it's in the pipeline, so to speak. But the big question for you geopolitically, and as a futurist, I've never lived through a time in history that we're living through right now. The political disruptions, the economic disruptions, as you mentioned, AI robotics is going to disrupt the whole workforce equation that we thought was linear, and it's not going to be linear anymore. But the last thing I'll mention, of course, is what we all worry about is global warming. So I'm an outlier probably in this group. I'm very optimistic. We moved the family up here. Sherry, my wife, is in the room here right now with my daughter because I'm the most optimistic person about our region, probably in Humboldt County. I think that we've got the weather. We're probably going to look, climatologists are saying, look more like Santa Cruz. So the redwoods will survive. but a lot of people are going to be getting away from a month worth of triple-digit heat, rising sea level, all the things that everyone reads about and knows about. But I'm just saying again, I think we've got a lot of nothing up here, a lot of everything in terms of beauty, but not a lot of people on it. So I'm just wondering, Pacific Rim facing, which is the most robust piece of the world economy, we're right on the edge of all of that. How can we take advantage of those things other than the strategies that you kind of suggested today?
Yeah, so under the thank you, Ken. That's great. Under the supposition that you'd see more climate refugees, for example, which I think you're kind of alluding to, how much of them would come there ready to work or bring a business with them that you'd have a little bit more of an economic boost alongside of the living boost, right? Because that's one of the classic ways that we sell Northern California is the climate, the lifestyle, the being able to take advantage of the outdoors in a bunch of different ways in one place. And, you know, in general, the climate, even if it changes, is really still not that bad. Even if Santa Cruz changes, it actually might warm up a little bit and people might want that happen along the coast. Of course, you know, it's happening for the wrong reasons. But let me give you two sort of larger items. One is that a place like Humboldt County should think about what it can do uniquely in that space now. So there were 18, 24 months ago, there was a lot of talk about the blue economy because the supposition was there were things that could happen out in the ocean that were unique to Humboldt County that could actually have maybe global reach to them over time. And that's something that still should be pursued. Now, the climate change stuff is also something that could be unique to Humboldt County in terms of how do you build a community that has a unique relationship between the ocean, the forest, its own climate that's also changing, and then as it changes over time, what lessons are there to be learned, or for like you alluded to earlier, are there ways of thinking about the cannabis industry or hemp more generally that again deliver a unique result in terms of the entrepreneurship that has come out of Humboldt County? You really got to think more about niche, uniqueness, and are those global sellers in the end? And I think you should be optimistic. I mean, the beauty of Humboldt County is you do have inbound resources. You've got a Cal Poly there. You have a relatively unique area in terms of drawing eyes toward it and potentially wanting to be there, especially if climate change continues in the path it's been on. Humboldt County may be a place that finds itself in a unique position over time, to your point. I'm hoping, and I'm also optimistic that, in fact, the next couple of administrations will continue along a line that says that there are a lot of potential, you know, triple bottom line outcomes if we look at addressing climate change and look for places that can be sort of the tip of the spear in those entrepreneurial efforts. And Humboldt County might be able to find its way in that space over time because of its uniqueness in those areas. That after that, it's all very hypothetical, to your point, right? If you're a forecaster, you've really got to sort through, you know, will AI kick the legs out from underneath that? Will climate change happen fast enough to really accelerate investment? Those kind of things. And will, you know, again, will somebody like Elon Musk, who's made most of his adult life in trying to provide products that are meant to address climate change in some ways, now shift to some weird new thing, or will he be able to actually shift to a more moderate stance on climate change and actually drive more entrepreneurship in that space? That's where, and that's a lot of stuff to talk about with a beer in your hand for sure, at least in the short term.
There's another question. Do you have any perspective on the reintroduction of hemp as an industrial product and the agricultural and processing opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to people who were in the cannabis industry, they were very concerned about hemp more generally in terms of the marketplace. I think that we have to find a way of having both kind of live side by side. That's my take. It is there needs, again, just like with the regulatory environment, there needs to be this sort of partnership transition of how we're going to split the market up and where can entrepreneurship find its way to making Humboldt County a unique place to do both hemp and cannabis for adult consumption parallel to each other and solidify market share over time. Because if cultivation is happening and you can actually have them all walking side by side, why not grab as much of that niche as humanly possible?
We've got time for perhaps one more question if anybody has something they'd like to ask of Dr. Eyler.
Eddie.
Go ahead.
Really quick question here. So I had the opportunity to, be part of different nation building and in different countries around the world. And we love economists. Economists are great people and things of that nature, but they're usually not boots on the ground. And so my question to you is, what are some of the local people that you think we should be asking to getting the information? Is it a Chamber of Commerce? Who are these people that we should be looking at for good information?
So, I mean, certainly your local, the cities and the county are good places to have partnerships in terms of having the data and having a real sort of real-time sense of what's going on. Cal Poly Humboldt is a guy named Eric Escher, who I went to graduate school with at UC Davis, who's an amazing economist. He's somebody I would hook on to, and he has done things locally, both in the cannabis space and in the sort of monitoring of what the North Coast area and sort of the region, how it's evolved economically. Eric is an amazing resource. But other than that, it really is incumbent upon the cities and the county to provide that information and have either a local advocacy group or chamber partner in such a way to find out what's going on from a taxable sales standpoint in real time. What's going on with respect to residential and commercial investment in real time? What's going on with infrastructure investment in real time? What is the plan for grant pursuits? So, for example, your federally elected officials, what are they doing to drive more activity in terms of current spending and potential spending for the North Coast, making investment, not just filling programs in, but actually making investment looking forward 10 years, not just 10 months. And this is what's going to be very intriguing under the coming in presidential regime, as well, and thinking more toward the midterm elections. Because after that, we don't have a clue. The supposition is we're going to see a lot of change in the next 24 months, and then we might see some change. We just don't know what direction yet. But the hope is that we're able to really generate more resources, if possible, over the next 2 years to get ready for the next 10. There's a lot of concern that actually will go the other direction and start walking away from blue toward red counties and states. It'll be very intriguing to watch how that interplay takes place with Congress and the president over the next at least 12 months.
So
Thanks,
we are at time. Ken, I know you've got another question, and Dr. Eyler, I don't know what your availability is to
yeah, Ken, real quick, I'll take one more and then I have to move on, for better or for worse, but Ken, please.
Well, it was in the chat. I'm really interested in that grant-driven study you said you were involved with on the Pacific Northwest.
Oh yeah, email me and I'll send it to you. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So this email that's up on the screen, just email me and I'll take care of you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Of course. I'm sorry I missed that question.
No worries.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you again, Dr. Eyler, for
thanks, everybody.
Really interesting and robust conversation, and thanks for making it local. Thanks for talking a lot about local small businesses, as we had talked about, and the emphasis on collaboration and finding niche markets is, kind of came through loud and clear. So if any of the rest of you have questions that you'd like to forward to Dr. Eyler, his information is on the screen at Bobby7007.
Yeah, that's my handle.
Rob, so
that's my handle, but then because my mom calls me Bobby. Yeah. But that email is the easiest way of getting hold of me.
Yeah, great. I've only known you as Rob, so
I know. Yeah, and that's how I want everybody else to know me too. My mom's just got a special place on that one.
There you go. But thank you again so much. You hit all the points that I had requested, and appreciate your time. And thank you everybody for being with us. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Take care, folks. Thanks.